Welcome to the Everything History Podcast for episode 50, De Caesaribus, part 4, by Sextus Aurelius Victor. As I said last time, please note that I myself, Thomas, the narrator, interrupt at no point. So when the first person is used, that is Victor speaking, not me. Also to be mindful of, this book is not without flaws. There are many inaccuracies and prejudices that are written as facts by Victor. They are not. Much of the information contained within De Caesaribus is flat out wrong, but most of it is correct. This is especially true for the Caesars, or emperors as we call them, that the senatorial and equestrian classes despised. Victor also occasionally speaks in a manner that contemporary individuals might find insensitive.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Section 29. However, Decius, who was born in a village near Sirmium, had conspired to gain the imperial power by virtue of his military position and, overjoyed at the death of his enemies, had appointed his son, named Etruscus, as Caesar. He immediately sent the latter ahead to Illyricum, while he remained behind at Rome for a time in order to dedicate the monuments which he had constructed. In the meantime, the head of Jotopianus was suddenly brought to him, as is the custom. He, boasting of his descent from Alexander, had been killed on authority of the soldiers as he was attempting a rebellion in Syria. And at the same time, during those very days, the supreme power was offered to Lucius Priscus, who was ruling Macedonia as governor, as a result of the incursion of the Goths after they had plundered most of Thrace and penetrated that far. When Decius had left Rome as quickly as he could, for that reason, Julius Valens seized the imperial power at the urgent insistence of the common people. Yet both of them were soon killed, since the nobility had decreed Priscus an enemy of the state. Decius and his son, while pursuing the barbarians across the Danube, died through treachery at Abritus after reigning 2 years. But very many report that the deaths of Trajan Decius and his son were honorable, that, in fact, the son had befallen in battle while pressing an attack too boldly, that the father, however, died while his dejected soldiers were saying many things to console their emperor, had strenuously asserted that the loss of one soldier seemed to him too little to matter. And so he resumed the war and died in a similar manner while fighting vigorously. Section 30. When the senators had learned of this, they voted the rank of Augustus to Gallus and Hostilianus, and appointed Volusianus, the son of Gallus, as Caesar. Thereafter a plague broke out, and while it raged ever more violently, Hostilianus died, but Gallus and Volusianus won popular favor, because they meticulously and assiduously arranged the burials of all the poorest folk. Section 31. Consequently, while they were kept at Rome, Aemilius Aemilianus seized the imperial power by suborning the soldiers. They set out to attack him, but were cut down at Iteramna by their own soldiers, who hoped for a greater reward from Aemilianus, to whom victory came without labor or losses, and also because they lacked restraint through their self-indulgence and wantonness, and had perverted the duties they owed for the benefits they received. While all of these were in power, however, 2 years elapsed. For Aemilianus, too, ruled moderately for 3 months before being carried off by sickness, and although at first the senators had declared him an enemy, afterwards, when his predecessor had died, in the face of circumstances, as is usual, they acclaimed him Augustus. Section 32. On the other hand, the soldiers, who had been gathered from all the sectors and were detained in Rhaetia because of the impending war, bestowed the empire on Licinius Valerianus. He, although he was of a reasonably distinguished family, was nevertheless pursuing a military career, as was still the custom at that time. The Senate made his son, Gallienus, Caesar, and straightway, though it was high summer, that the Tiber overflowed as if it were in spate. Wise men predicted disaster for the state on account of the changeable nature of the young man, because he had been summoned and had come from Etruria, from where the aforementioned river flows. This in fact immediately occurred, for when his father was engaged in an indecisive and prolonged war in Mesopotamia, he was captured through the treachery of the Persian king, whose name was Sapor, and Valerian was cruelly mutilated and died in the 6th year of his reign while still a robust old man. Section 33. At the same time, although he was strenuously attempting to drive the Germans out of Gaul, Licinius Gallienus hurriedly descended on Illyricum. There at Mursa he defended Ingibus, the governor of Pannonia, who had conceived a desire to be emperor after learning of Valerian's disaster, and subsequently Regalianus, who had renewed the war after rallying the soldiers who had survived the disaster at Mursa. Since his suppression of these was fortunate and beyond what he had prayed for, like men who are lucky, he became excessively careless, and together with his son, Saloninus, on whom he had conferred the rank of Caesar, he shipwrecked the Roman state, so to speak, to such a degree that the Goths freely penetrated Thrace and occupied Macedonia, Achaia, and the border regions of Asia. The Parthians seized Mesopotamia, and bandits, or more accurately a woman, controlled the rest. At that time, too, a force of Alemanni took possession of Italy, while tribes of Franks pillaged Gaul and occupied Spain, where they ravaged and almost destroyed the town of Tarraconensis. And some, after conveniently acquiring ships, penetrated as far as Africa. Even the territories across the Danube, which Trajan had secured, were lost. Thus, throughout the whole world, the mightiest things were mixed with the small, the lowest with the highest, as if by winds violently gusting from all directions. And at the same time, the plague was ravaging Rome, which often occurs in times of unbearable anxieties and spiritual despair. During these events, Gallienus himself frequented taverns and eating houses, kept up his friendships with pimps and drunkards, and abandoned himself to his wife, Salonina, and to his shameful love affair with the daughter of Attalus, a king of the Germans, whose name was Pippa. For this reason, civil wars also broke out, which were far more frightful. For first of all, Posthumus, who happened to be in charge of the barbarians in Gaul, seized the imperial power. After he had driven off a horde of Germans, he was involved in a war with Laelianus, whom he routed just as successfully, but he then perished in a revolt of his own men, supposedly since he had refused to allow them, despite their insistence, to plunder the inhabitants of Mainz, because they had supported Laelianus. At his death, therefore, Marius, a former blacksmith who was not even particularly well known to the military, seized power. Accordingly, everything had degenerated so far that imperial powers were bestowed on such individuals, and the dignity of noble qualities was an object of derision. Indeed, it was because of this that the joke was told that it was hardly surprising if a Marius was attempting to restore the Roman state, since a Marius of the same trade and a founder of the family and name had consolidated it. When he had been murdered after 2 days, Victorinus was chosen, who equaled Posthumus in military expertise, but was a compulsive lecher. Although he restrained himself at the beginning, he forcibly violated very many women. And after a reign of 2 years, when he forced his attentions on the wife of Titianus, and she informed her husband of the outrage, the soldiers were secretly incited, and he was killed at Cologne in a mutiny. So powerful were the companies of quartermasters, in whose ranks Attianus was serving, that their criminal action was accomplished even though they were attempting a difficult task. They are a kind of people, especially in these times, who are worthless, venal, underhand, rebellious, greedy, and, so to speak, fashioned by nature for committing and concealing frauds. They control supplies, and therefore they are the enemies of those collecting the produce and of the well-being of the farmers, since they are proficient in the opportune bribery of those through whose folly and ruin they have amassed their wealth. Meanwhile, Victoria, after the loss of her son Victorinus, bought the approval of the legions with a large sum of money and made Tetricus emperor. He was of a noble family, and was serving as governor of Aquitaine, and the title and trappings of Caesar were bestowed upon his son, Tetricus. But at Rome, Gallienus was busy dishonestly persuading the people who were unaware of the state's misfortunes that all regions had been pacified. And frequently he even held games and triumphal processions, as is normal when events turn out as one wishes, so that he might more readily substantiate his sham successes. But after danger began to approach, he finally left the city. For Aurelius, since he was in command of the legions in Raetia, had seized the imperial power because of the negligence of such an indolent leader, as is customary, and was marching on Rome. Gallienus routed him in battle at the bridge which is named Aurelius after him, and drove him to Milan. While he was attacking that city with machines of every kind, he was killed by his own men. Aurelius, you see, when he saw that his hopes of raising the siege were futile, cunningly composed a list of names of Gallienus's generals and tribunes, as if they had been assigned by him for execution, and threw the document down from the wall as secretly as possible. It happened to be found by those mentioned in it, and instilled the fear and suspicion that their deaths had been ordered. But they thought that it had been divulged because of the negligence of his staff. Consequently, in accordance with the plan of Aurelian, whose popularity and prestige in the army were exceptional, they faked an enemy attack, and since he was protected by none of his bodyguards, as is normal in a sudden crisis, they led him out of his tent at the dead of night, and he was run through with a spear by an assailant, who was not identified because of the darkness. Thus his assassination went unavenged because the actual murderer was not known, or because what had happened was for the common good. Admittedly, moral standards have fallen to such a degree that most men act in their own interest rather than the interest of the state, and in their eagerness for power rather than for reputation. Hence, too, the essence of things and of titles has been corrupted. While for the most part one who has become more powerful through a crime, when he has won the day by arms, calls it the removal of tyranny, if he suppresses people to the detriment of the state. Moreover, some men, who are Gallienus's equals in lust, are enrolled in the ranks of the gods, though they are scarcely worthy of the last rites. If the credibility of history had not prevented this, for it neither permits honorable men to be deprived of the rewards of being remembered, nor allows the wicked to acquire an eternal, illustrious reputation, virtue would be sought in vain, since that true and unique distinction would be granted through favor to all the worst men and impiously denied the good. Eventually, the senators were compelled by Claudius to declare Gallienus a god, because he had obtained the imperial power through Gallienus's decision. For when the latter realized by the flow of blood from such a serious wound that death was close, he assigned the imperial insignia to Claudius, who was commanding the garrison force at Ticinum with the rank of tribune. This was obviously extorted, since the crimes of Gallienus cannot be concealed as long as there are cities, and all the worst emperors will always be considered like him and his equal. Actually, as far as one may conjecture, emperors and the best persons reach heaven, or, through their reputation among men, are celebrated like gods because of the glory of their lives rather than because of the titles they have sought and amassed. But the Senate, upon learning of his death, decreed that his followers and friends should be thrown headlong over the Gemonian steps, and it is generally accepted that a treasury lawyer was led into the Senate and was punished by having his eyes torn out, while a mob burst in, and with equal clamor begged Mother Earth and even the gods of the underworld to give Gallienus a place among the damned. And if Claudius had not given orders immediately after the capture of Milan that those who had chanced to survive should be spared, ostensibly because the army had demanded it, the nobility and common people would have run riot even more savagely. And indeed, in addition to the general malaise of the Roman world, the abuse of their own order provoked the senators because he, fearing that the imperial power would be transferred to the best of the nobility through his sloth, was the first to prohibit the senators from undertaking a military career or entering the army. Gallienus's reign lasted 9 years. Section 34. But the soldiers, whom the desperate state of affairs compelled, quite contrary to their natural inclination, to make the right decisions, when they realized that everything was in shambles, eagerly approved and praised the accession of Claudius, a man who could endure hard work, was just, and totally dedicated to the state, so much so that after a long interval he revived the tradition of the Decii. For when he wanted to drive out the Goths, whom the lapse in time had made excessively strong and virtually inhabitants, it was revealed by the Sibylline books that the foremost man of the most elevated order had to be consecrated to victory. And when the man who seemed to be meant had offered himself, Claudius showed that the responsibility belonged rather to him who was, in fact, the leader of the Senate and of all men. Thus the barbarians were routed and driven out with no loss to the army after the emperor had made a gift of his life to the state. In fact, good emperors consider the safety of their fellow citizens and their own enduring reputation more valuable, for these not only contribute to their glory, but also in some way to the good fortune of their successors. If indeed Constantius and Constantine and our own emperors, and of her body she was more acceptable to the soldiers, because of their expectations of rewards or license. Consequently, the victory was sad and rather troublesome, since subjects, as is their custom, more readily defend lax regimes than useful ones, through their desire to commit crimes with impunity. Section 35. Furthermore, Aurelian, made more impetuous by his great success, immediately marched against the Persians as if the war were in its final stages. Aurelius defeated them, and he returned to Italy, where the cities were being harassed by the incursions of the Alemanni. At the same time, when the Germans had been driven out of Gaul, the legions of Tetricus, whom we have mentioned above, were cut down after being betrayed by their own general. For Tetricus, because he was frequently being assailed by his soldiers who had been corrupted by the intrigue of the governor Faustinus, had begged for the protection of Aurelian by letter, and since the battle line had been led forward And since the battle line had been led forward for appearance's sake, during the fighting he surrendered to Aurelian as he approached. So, as is usual when there is no commander, the ranks were thrown into confusion and crushed. Tetricus himself, after 2 years of exalted power, was led in triumph, but then obtained the governorship of Lucania, and for his son pardon and senatorial rank. In the same manner, the mint workers in the city were destroyed, since at the instigation of the treasurer, Pelicissimus, they had been filing off the coin marks. In fear of punishment, they had fought so serious a war that after a gathering on the Caelian hill, they killed about 7,000 troops. After so many great successes, Aurelian constructed a magnificent temple to the sun at Rome, decorating it with opulent offerings. And to prevent what had occurred under Gallienus from ever happening again, Aurelian enclosed the city with the strongest walls possible and enlarged their perimeter. And at the same time he carefully supervised generous supplies of pork so that he might allocate sufficient quantities to the Roman populace. False charges laid by treasury officials or informers which had distressed the city were suppressed. Registers and documents dealing of this kind were burned, and an amnesty was decreed in the Greek manner. In the meantime, he rigorously prosecuted acts of greed, embezzlement, and those committing extortion in the provinces, contrary to the customary behavior of the military, from whose ranks he came. For this reason he was entrapped and killed at Conofrurium through the villainy of an assistant to whom he had entrusted the office of confidential secretary, since that man, conscious of his graft and criminal activity, had handed over to the tribunes, as if doing them a favor, cunningly composed letters containing orders for their execution. Alarmed by fear of that, they committed the crime. Meanwhile the soldiers, once they had lost their emperor, immediately sent envoys to Rome to ask the senators to select an emperor of their own choice. When they replied that this was the particular responsibility of the soldiers, the legions again referred it to them. Thus the matter was debated with a propriety and moderation on both sides. Virtues rare among the people, especially in matters of this kind, and almost unheard of with the soldiers. So much did that man Aurelian achieve by his severity and incorruptibility, that the announcement of his murder brought destruction to the perpetrators. And it was a source of fear to the wicked and also to those wavering, a cause of regret to all the best men, and a source of arrogance or ostentation to none. And furthermore a sort of interregnum occurred, as it had for Romulus alone, but far more glorious. This action in particular demonstrated that everything revolves in the manner of a circle, and nothing happens which the power of nature cannot reproduce in the course of time. And, in addition, that even desperate situations are easily relieved by the virtues of the emperors, and more stable ones abruptly ruined by their vices. Section 36. Finally, therefore, in about the 6th month after the death of Aurelian, the Senate made Tacitus, one of the former consuls, emperor. He was certainly a kind man, and practically everyone was happier because the senators had recovered the right to choose the emperor from the arrogant military. This joy, however, was brief, and it did not have a tolerable outcome, for Tacitus soon died at Tyana, on the 200th day of his reign, but not until after he had first tortured to death the murderers of Aurelian, and in particular their ringleader, Mucapor, because he had struck the actual blow, and Florianus, Tacitus's brother, seized power without any decision being made by the Senate or the soldiers. Section 37. He, when he had held the absolute power tenuously for 1 or 2 months, was killed at Tarsus by his own men after they had accepted Probus, who had been proclaimed at Illyricum, and was almost a second Hannibal because of his great knowledge of warfare and his versatile training of the soldiers and his toughening of young recruits. For just as Hannibal considered the inactivity of his troops dangerous to the state and its leaders, and filled many parts of Africa with olive trees through their labor, in the same manner he, Probus, filled Gaul, the Pannonias, and the hills of Moesia with vineyards. Naturally, this occurred after he had crushed the barbarian tribes which had invaded when our emperors had been killed by the treachery of their own men. At the same time, Saturninus was cut down in the east, and Bonosus with his army at Cologne, for both had attempted to seize supreme power with the bands of troops they had commanded as generals. For this reason, when all the regions had been recovered and pacified, it is reported that he stated that in a short time soldiers would be unnecessary. Eventually, therefore, they became even more incensed, and they cut him down at Sirmium after a little less than 6 years, as he was compelling them to drain the city, his birthplace, with reservoirs and a ditch, since it was damaged by winter rains on account of its marshy soil. From this point on, the power of the military increased, and the right of appointing the emperor was snatched from the Senate up to our own times. though it is uncertain whether the Senate desired this through apathy or fear, or because of its hatred of civil conflicts. In fact, it could have regained its right to military service, which had been lost through the Edict of Gallienus during the reign of Tacitus, when the legions were duly compliant. And Florianus would not have rashly seized power, nor would it have been granted to any man, however good, by the decision of the common soldiers, if members of that most distinguished and honorable order of senators had been serving in the army. But as long as they find their gratification in leisure and simultaneously fear for their wealth, the enjoyment and abundance of which they consider more important than what is eternal, they pave the way for the soldiers and virtually for the barbarians to have absolute power over themselves and their descendants. End of section 37. Remember that you can contact me on the podcast Facebook page or at the email address everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.